And we're live. Good morning, everybody. And this is a very special fireside chat with John Hagstrom, who is second trumpet of the Chicago Symphony. John, good morning and happy Memorial Day.
Thank you very much, and happy Memorial Day to you too.
Excellent. I want to start off this fireside chat with a recording that you made of a very special Memorial Day piece that you played many times when you were principal trumpet of the President's Own Marine Band in Washington, D.C. I was wondering if we could go ahead and play the video of taps?
Please do.
Absolutely. That's beautiful. Honestly, it just it sends chills up my spine, and it's really an honor to hear such a high caliber of trumpet playing play that taps. So, John, thank you first of all for your service to the country.
It's my pleasure, my honor, of course, and thank you for spending your time with me today.
Oh wow, it's an honor. So, would you tell me a little bit about what it feels like to play taps at the Arlington Cemetery dressed in uniform?
Well, you feel a great sense of responsibility. It's part of the funeral ceremony. In the Marine Corps, the funeral sort of sequence of events has a chapel ceremony, and then the band marches with the caisson to the graveside, and then there's a graveside ceremony with the priest or whatever kind of official will say something. The family seated, and they at one point one of the military members gives a signal, and at a distance the band is playing. It has played, and but before taps plays, there is a rifle party. There's 7 riflemen who then each fire 3 shots in unison, and at the end of that, that's when taps happens. So the experience of doing it is you're waiting a long time, for all this to happen, and you can't warm up, and so you've got to really be able to own it, without any kind of extra preparation.
Now, John, when you play this for the service, do you play it on a trumpet or do you play it on a bugle? Because traditionally, this was written for a bugle, right?
Well, yeah, buglers it's what the notes are, that fit on the bugle. But in the band, you play it on at that time I was playing a cornet in the band.
Okay.
And so I played on a cornet. And the reason for that is because the rest of the ceremony involves you playing other pieces that require more notes than just that are on the bugle.
Okay.
But I did that. And the answer to your other question is that, you can feel a lot of pressure to do it just right. And as you know, the bugler who played taps for Kennedy's funeral, felt that pressure.
Have you heard stories about that? Have you talked to the bugler who played for Kennedy's funeral?
I didn't know he was gone long before that I was in Washington. But I can tell you that it's in defense of anybody who makes an error playing taps. It's very difficult circumstantially because it's a big moment. It means everything. Everyone's completely quiet and focused, and what makes it worse, my very first time playing taps with the band in Arlington Cemetery was 20 degrees and freezing. I stood there for 45 minutes, and whether or not this was the intention of the guy who wrote taps, it works great in the cold weather because the first two notes are kind of low, and you kind of work your way up to the high note, which you probably couldn't play when you're cold. So each stepwise sequence, proceeds, gets you ready for the next one.
You don't have a bugle you could show us, do you?
I don't, but I did bring some interesting trumpets to show you later.
I see all the trumpets behind you. I mean, what I was hoping to do is just show the difference between a trumpet, a bugle, and maybe a cornet. But
I don't have a bugle.
You can describe it. It's basically a trumpet without valves.
Yeah, I've got a C trumpet here, so this is a C trumpet.
Okay.
And if you take the valves out, it was just a straight tube coiled up. That would be a bugle.
Okay. And so, I mean, does it feel different to play a bugle when there are no valves? Does it change how it feels?
Not really, but the quality of bugles normally is not built to the same level as a professional trumpet. Yeah. And a bugle can be in a number of different keys, in the key of G or B flat. Is
just like natural horns.
Yeah, and so most bugles are in B flat now, and but there's a variety of different keys. We play the C trumpet in the Chicago Symphony, and there are actually a few bugles that are in the key of C. And so, yes, that's a difference. And this is a trumpet, and if we're going to get technical about it, I've got a cornet here behind me.
Huh. And that's a cornet.
And the difference between a trumpet and a cornet wraps around twice. It's a smaller mouthpiece, and instead of coiled around once like a trumpet, it coils around twice.
Huh.
This is a very special cornet. This is the Kahn Perfected Wonder from 1908.
Huh.
And it's the cornet preferred by Otto Schubert, who was the principal trumpet at that time. And in the early years of the Chicago Symphony, there were cornets listed in the program and trumpets, and two separate groups of players. And so within the cornet parts of the Chicago Symphony, over 100 years ago, this was the instrument he was pictured with, and it's quite a good cornet.
And so is that the actual trumpet that Otto Schuler played?
Otto Schubert? No, it's not. I don't have that, but you've set me up perfectly for his trumpet, because I do have his trumpet.
No kidding.
Is the 1905 French Besson Grand Prix C trumpet that Otto Schubert owned. He was principal trumpet of the Concerto Orchestra, and then came to Chicago in 1907, hired by Frederick Stock, and played principal trumpet till 1911. But before he came, the Chicago Symphony played German instruments that had the rotary valves instead of the piston valves. So these were the first piston valves used in the Chicago Symphony.
No kidding.
And in 1907, that's when the section switched from the rotary valve German instruments to the piston valves that we use today. And Otto Schubert played a C trumpet, which is, everyone thinks, oh, it was Herseth who brought the C trumpet. He certainly did. They had, a couple decades of B-flat trumpets before Herseth showed up. But the actual first occurrence of C trumpet in the Chicago Symphony was in 1907 with this trumpet. So
unbelievable. What a piece of history. I mean, and especially, it's so fitting that a member of the Chicago Symphony trumpet section has the first piston valve trumpet. Is that one of the first piston valve trumpets that was played in an American orchestra, do you think?
No, that's not true. But see, the Chicago Symphony is a German orchestra. So mainly immigrants that make it up in its early history. So the piston valve is more of a French kind of influence. And so in that the early players of the orchestra were from Germany, immigrants. They played the German instruments, but the French, the piston designs were so much better in terms of allowing players to play more accurately, with greater endurance and with greater facility.
And nuance too, right?
It was an easy switch in terms of what would be better. But still, there's clearly a long-standing tradition, and we play both the German and the piston instruments now because the different kinds of repertoire sound better one to the other. And so that's part of our.
Having played in Berlin, they mostly play. I would say almost exclusively played the German trumpets, the rotary trumpets. Would you have one of those you could show us?
Sure. Matter of fact, I will get one that
but I can tell from experience that the rotary trumpets that I heard in the Berlin Philharmonic had such a sweet, just really rich, sound. And I mean, it's just different. I mean, I can't explain. It's not so kind of like pointed, but it's more, like kind of round. And then
it's a more rounded sound. This is a trumpet built by Heckel.
like the bassoon.
Bassoon's the same
No
family,
kidding.
not the same. Yeah, and so Friedrich Auen Heckel built trumpets, and with him along with Schmidt. I've heard of course, the Schmidt horns.
Yeah, absolutely.
And in the first Chicago Symphony trumpet section, a guy named Albert Ulrich had a Schmidt trumpet, which we still have today, and it's actually behind me to my far left, which you can't see inside the frame, but it plays very well, but it has exactly the qualities you described. It's a warmer, more rounded, weightier sound, which fits very well in the German repertoire because that was the sound.
Such as Bruckner, Brahms.
Beethoven and Mendelssohn, those kinds of composers, the kind of trumpet parts they write fit very well with the German instruments.
Wow.
So yes, I was going to save that for later, but you got me into instruments right away. And as you can probably suspect, I collect trumpets, and but not just for just to have them, because each of them has a voice and has something to teach me. And the history, fortunately, comes right back alive, and we can, in some ways, have a little conversation with our predecessors or someone who cared enough to make something excellent. And that's a big part of what we do in the Chicago Symphony, as you know.
Absolutely. I mean, that's a perfect segue for the tradition of brass playing in the Chicago Symphony. I mean, how would you characterize the style of the Chicago Symphony brass section?
Well, but many people equate Chicago Symphony brass sound with something that's loud. And sometimes then there has been, years of the CSO brass, which was extremely loud and still is extremely loud. And so there's a muscularity to it. So that tends to be a popular notion, which has truth. But I think, the emphasis on CSO brass is really a symptom of the quality and sort of nth degree of effort and commitment of the entire orchestra.
Yes.
And that has to do with the kind of cultural tradition of the players, giving their very best without having to be asked. And sometimes there's not, and for many years, there were not protections for the players. So if they weren't doing that, they were dismissed.
Wow, that's a lot of pressure. I mean, can you imagine? Like, it just seems like, in those days, I mean, what I've heard is like, that story about Bud Herseth playing Also Sprach. And I believe, I don't know if it's true or not, but the story is that he was playing, the orchestra was playing Also Sprach, and it has that famous trumpet excerpt, dum ba dum ba. And Dr. Reiner, went over that passage again and again. And then about the fifth or sixth time that happened, then Mr. Herseth put his trumpet down and said, I'm not going to miss. You can do this as many times as you want, but I'm not going to miss it.
Well, that's a great story. And it is... whether the specifics were exactly that or something else, it illustrates the fact that Reiner had high expectations.
Yes.
And if you weren't up to it, he would let you know that he was aware of that. But Herseth himself would tell me that he thought Reiner got a little bit of a bad rap.
Really?
That he said, what Reiner wanted was that you were trying your best all the time. And then, as now, there are players who just do the bare minimum. They show up and they don't know their part, and they're just kind of, who's going to make me kind of attitude.
But I feel like that's in the Chicago Symphony. That's not the norm. I mean, I honestly can't think of like anyone in the Chicago Symphony that's like that. And it seems like the Chicago Symphony is one of those orchestras where everyone really cares and everyone brings 150%.
Right.
And
right. And I agree with you in the moments of the concert, I think the CSO is unique in that we'll do whatever it takes. But there are increments, as you surely know, of
As with any organization, like a
right, and it's
baseball
yeah,
team, the Yankees
right,
down to the the AAA Mud Hens.
yeah, it's human nature. If you get 100 people together, a couple of them are not going to be as motivated as the others, and
Yeah.
that's natural. And it's actually, it's you could say, well, we've got to get it 100%. Well, in some ways, the fact that it's not 100%, but can still be so moving, so transcendent, it's transformational, uh, is an endorsement for how powerful the art form really is.
Yes.
That without a unanimity, you can still change people's lives.
Wow.
And through, if you think about, any sort of team of craftsmen, not every one of them is painting your house like it was their own house. And yet they're good enough at it that it makes you into an idyllic kind of residence. And so in some way, the CSO is sort of constructing you this palace of your mind. And if every you need enough of the workers and architecture and a plan so that it gets done and gets done well, within the codes and the law. And when it is, you can live in it. And that's the way it always is. That's how humans are. And yet humans have invented this mechanism, this constructed kind of team of a symphony orchestra that sort of launders out the sort of partial commitments and leaves us with something that can change your life. And I think you've done enough of these interviews that you've heard people say that, I heard, Dan Gingrich talks about how in 1969 he walked up the stairs and heard Mahler too, and he said when he came down the stairs, he knew he had to do this for the rest of his life. There was no question in his mind that he'd found his calling, and it's that kind of a conversion that people have, if not to be players, but then to be consumers and to be really uplifted and create for themselves a very close and constant relationship with music. Because just like these trumpets, which have a kind of voice from the past,
yes,
the composers, there's a timelessness of emotional intelligence within the human mind. And so while someone's not physically alive, their intellect, their sense of what restores us, how we travel and come back to an original idea and feel renewed and invigorated, that hasn't changed.
No, the feelings are still the same, right? The feelings of love, the feelings of sadness, the feelings of joy, those feelings.
Yeah. And even uncertainty or all the whole spectrum. And I think, what we don't often talk about is how, something like, jealousy or just some sort of fury, which we don't get to express really in a more cultured society, is not only acceptable, it's necessary to have a full experience. And so when you're here on Heldenleben, you're hearing a battle. You're hearing crimes. People are committing crimes on that battlefield. And you're hearing, but somehow it's okay.
Yeah.
Because you know that it's a virtual kind of experience, and yet it exercises the full palette of our humanity.
John, you made a really great point there that we get to experience these feelings in the context of an hour. We get to experience them in the context of 2,000 people, right? Yeah. And then we also get to experience them and no one gets hurt, right? It's there's these, intense moments of rage or battle or whatever. And, we get to listen to those and experience those feelings. And then at the end, it's, everyone's still, intact.
It's totally legal.
Yeah.
And that's the beauty of it. And yet, that, you've educated yourself as to that resource, that's there for you, that you can tap into it anytime you want. And it's part of being a higher-minded, more educated person, is to know the timelessness of our human condition. Wow. And to know how we can rejoin, the wisdom and the kind of maturity that preceded us. And so, I wouldn't want to be operated on by a doctor in 1894, but what Theodore Thomas, who founded the CSO, the kind of interpretational kind of thoughts and musical kind of journeys he took people on would be just as moving if we were to hear them today, just as relevant, just as needed. And we can tap into that. And I think that's, if for no other reason, and there are millions of reasons, that's such an important kind of pillar under which on which we stand, is the sense of the voice of the orchestra kind of checking us and teaching us and sort of aligning us with the never changing compass of human aspiration, human struggle, human triumph. Is that we share that with all of our predecessors and with the future.
Yeah.
And so part of our job is to fully receive that energy, and part of our job is to fully transmit it.
Wow.
And so that requires the discipline and the alignment and the sort of deference that you and I both exhibit within the orchestra to the maestro and to one another.
I mean, John, you're one of the hardest working musicians I know. Absolutely. And I can't help but to think that maybe some of that discipline came from your time in the military. I mean, you understood what it took, to be committed. I mean, what it took to be dedicated, to persevere under adverse conditions. And then also to be part of a whole, right? Like you were talking earlier about this giant mechanism, right? And you're talking about just being like one tiny like cog in the wheel. And what could you explain maybe your job as a second trumpet, and just explain kind of like what the role would be to someone who might not understand what that is?
Right. Well, that's a great question. I'm glad you asked. And the role of the second trumpeter is very complex and but very misunderstood, not only by other musicians and other audience members, but sometimes by the people who you work directly side by side with. If the second trumpet's doing his job right, the first trumpet sounds inhumanly strong, inhumanly commanding. And so what you're doing, you're building your skill to be very perfectly aligned.
Yes.
And with that sort of time, the rhythmic alignment and the color alignment and the expressive alignment, what you do is you magnify. My job is not to lead, it's to follow, but you can follow, like if you ever read responsive reading in church where the congregation reads and the priest reads, like technically those people are following, and read what they're supposed to, but it's not very good.
Yeah.
They wouldn't, no one's going to pay to hear that, are they?
Yeah.
Okay. So following is a pretty big category. So when following is absolutely perfected, when it's one and the same, and yet one of those people, someone is leading and someone is still following. And so my role is not to lead, but to magnify and to kind of legitimize and reinforce the leading voice.
Wow.
And when that happens, that voice is magnified and has more power to lead others.
Huh.
So if I'm canceling out the first trumpet player, he can't connect with you, and he can't, get the attention of the string section. And that could be something about the style or the pitch center or the shape of the phrase, and all of that gets broadcast and sort of received in a way that isn't spoken. We don't have a meeting about it, but it's sort of understood and acknowledged. Like, well, that's a good idea. That's a good phrasing. That makes sense. And we never had that kind of dialogue, and yet we absorb that kind of dialect, if you will, and that is passed down. And so now we have a sort of intergenerational kind of conduit, so that some of the traditions of the original players are still with us today.
Wow, as what?
Go ahead, I'm sorry.
What are some of those traditions that have been passed down through the generations in the brass section?
Well, I'll give you one example. Is the CSO, and the CSO brass was a very Germanic sound, so it was a very weighty, kind of darker color, and that still exists. We still do that very well, but over time things are added. When the C trumpet came with Herseth in 1948, he brought his colleagues from his training in the early 50s, you had a much brighter trumpet sound in juxtaposition with your darker lower brass sound, and it created this sort of spectacular, sparkly, and yet, anchored kind of sound. So there's those kinds of sort of, tracings you can find. But also, I would say that there are I would say, ethical kinds of traditions. And you referred to this earlier, that the CSO is willing to unify and in the final hour especially, find an alignment that doesn't cancel itself out. And there are orchestras within which there are great players, but they're having this sort of temper tantrum at all times. Everyone is so indulgent on their own that it becomes sort of chaotic in terms of, you can see that everybody is expressive, but does it really add up to anything? And this comes from the German kind of, I think, really the family and sort of work ethic of German culture.
Wow.
Early on. And you don't need to know, I have some German in me, but if you know.
I have about 3/4 German in me. 1 second. Right? Sorry, I just yanked out my earpiece. Yeah, there we go. So.
Then you already know that, the lockstep sense of Führer and the need for alignment and authority and obedience is what drives, the engine of progress and really productivity.
Well, I think it's an attention to detail, right? And I think it's a refinement of a process that already works, and the process of constantly wanting to refine and constantly, and I feel like there's a respect for the process, but also there's a big respect for tradition and a huge, work ethic, as well as, a big respect for family. And I think in Germany, they take care of the families almost better than anywhere else in the world.
There's a hierarchy, and once you're in the family, there's a loyalty there. But you earn that. There's a high bar for what gaining membership. And I've got here's a little thumbnail guide for when I've talked about this with two people, trying to introduce them to get the sensibility of it. And I like, how did this happen? And so I see it in 3 distinct sort of stages, and it goes right back to Theodore Thomas, who was really like the Thomas Jefferson of American symphony orchestras.
Yeah.
He really invented a lot of the protocols because he was personally accountable himself, both financially and artistically, and he gave more than he got, but he still got a lot.
Let's just back up. Theodore Thomas was the founder of the Chicago Symphony and maybe a couple other American orchestras, but he before that did a touring orchestra show of America. Was that connected with Barnum and Bailey, or was it was an orchestra that went?
No. Okay, let me help you. The Theodore Thomas toured under his own name.
Okay.
The Theodore Thomas Orchestra, and because he was so committed, he created a kind of a gold standard that when you saw the Theodore Thomas Orchestra was in town, you knew it was going to be worth it. And so he had quite a following.
Wow.
And then Charles Fay, a local businessman, approached him in 1891, or at least by 1891, had convinced him to come to Chicago with a guaranteed budget.
Wow.
That you didn't have to worry about ticket sales to pay your orchestra, because that's what Thomas did. And if they didn't make it up, he would pay it himself. Yeah. So he got a lot of loyalty you can expect from his players, because they didn't have to worry. They played good concerts, and he would take care of the rest.
Wow.
Okay, now he didn't found any other orchestras, but he was engaged by Boston Symphony, New York Philharmonic, and in some ways he was disgusted, and he writes this in his autobiography. He was disgusted with the New York Philharmonic because they, another gig that came along that paid, a little bit more, and you'd come in and there'd be like a cello playing the second bassoon part, because he says that very directly. And so the idea of this sort of sovereignty and the level of complete attention was what he saw as the catalyst for greatness, and he got it with the Theodore Thomas Orchestra and with what was then called the Chicago Orchestra initially when he came here in 1891. And with that, he was transformational, because he not only transformed the group of players, but he transformed the audiences. But the audiences were used to music as sort of a light entertainment and just sort of decorative stunts, as opposed to something more introspective. And he knew that this could be more meaningful. And here comes your Barnum and Bailey reference.
Okay.
This is which if people at home are going, what the heck is Cooper talking about?
I know. I knew I heard it somewhere. I thought I did.
You're right, and I'm gonna fill in the blank for you.
Thank you.
Theodor Thomas was born in 1835 in Germany. Came to America in 1845 with his family. He was just a street, his parents were city musicians. He did not come from privilege. He was self-made, which is another piece of his genius. In the early 1850s, in New York, there was enough of an audience that they could bring operatic stars, from Europe and do concerts, and make money on it. So P.T. Barnum did organize this with a singer named Jenny Lind, and the movie The Greatest Show on Earth,
yes,
with Hugh Jackman. That was a depiction of this whole scenario of what was happening, and it was dramatized, of course. But there's a point in the movie where he says, get me the cheapest musicians we can find, and we'll put on these concerts. Well, it turns out Theodor Thomas was one of the cheapest musicians he could find, and he was in that orchestra.
No kidding.
That accompanied those singers, and he writes about this in his autobiography. His autobiography, by the way, is only 107 pages.
Okay.
Okay.
So it's a must read for any Chicago Symphony fan.
member
or fan.
And true confessions, I didn't read it till I was in the orchestra for 20 years. So shame on me. But as someone who's wishing he'd done it sooner, David, do it sooner.
Okay, I'll do it. What? How do you know I haven't read it? I'm kidding. Yeah, I know.
Because I'm telling you this. But here's the big finale of the story, which is where the CSO originates. If you want to, where's the moment and why this all happened at all? And Theodor Thomas talks about being in this orchestra and listening to the singers, and he was sort of converted. He realized in this moment that music wasn't just a circus act. That he'd been sort of a touring sort of virtuoso, traveling violinist that would, just set up little programs, and he wasn't very musical, but he was, technical.
Wow.
And suddenly he realized that the voice and the beautiful phrasing and the nuances, that's what made music meaningful. Wow. And that's what elevated the listener to something higher. And he had this vision then that this could be done with instruments, and we could unify that kind of expression within instruments playing together, and we could do the same for audiences as it was being done for him in that moment.
Wow.
And it was impressed upon him so clearly and deeply that he spent the rest of his life doing that. And frankly, technically, he died trying, because as you may know, Orchestra Hall was finished in December of 1904, and he relentlessly worked to get it set just right, and it was cold, and he got pneumonia and died in early 1905. And fortunately, he'd finished his autobiography just the summer before, which, if you get it, it looks like a big book, but that's George Upton, who was the publisher, who wrote a bunch of other stuff. But just the part that Theodor Thomas wrote is very plain-spoken, really right to the point, and really enjoyable. It's within that book. So if you don't have to read the whole book, but what happens is you read his part, and then you want to read the rest. So, but the idea of all this is that our energy, our commitment, and I'm going to take you back to the leadership that he showed, turned into, point number 2, the ownership of the players. That the players saw, oh, I see what you're doing here. Yeah. Good idea. We're going to do it. We're buying into the family. Let's do this.
It's that collective pride.
Yeah, it's like you sort of see it. They see okay, I'm not just doing this because you're paying me. I see what you're trying to do. It makes sense. I'm in. Okay, and then Theodor Thomas dies, so he can't. They're not just following him with ownership; they have to have what I called stewardship.
Yes. So
they're taking it beyond, and so they just, instead of having some flamboyant conductor, they chose Frederick Stock, who was a mild-mannered violist. He was not a great conductor when he started, but they wanted him because they knew he would be a good steward of the values they had inherited from Theodor Thomas, and so we have this kind of lineage that where you've got this team of people who not only owned the idea, but they were committed to passing it forward. And it just happened in such a way that regenerated itself. Yeah. And I'll add one more piece to that, just as like, well, don't all orchestras kind of have that? Well, they do. I'm not taking away from other great traditions of committed musicians. But in 1919, the Civic Orchestra was created. Mm. And it was as much of anything as a response to World War I, where we didn't trust the Germans anymore, in case you didn't know.
Oh, yeah. That's when my great-grandmother and her family stopped speaking German in the family. I mean, they used to speak German in the house, and then as soon as World War I happened, everyone stopped speaking German.
Right. And CSO rehearsals were in German, and they had to stop speaking in German because they didn't want it. What are they talking about? And so Frederick Stock actually had to step down because he hadn't completed his citizenship. I mean, this was crazy.
Wow.
But the Civic Orchestra was started so that the Germans could train their protégés, and eventually their replacements could be of local nature and or of wherever they came from. They weren't just going to be a pipeline from Germany, which is pretty much what it had been.
Wow.
And so if you think about that process, now the new members of the orchestra are indebted to the older members. They're not just some new guy who comes in and doesn't give a crap about what happened before. They're having to buy in and study with, the guy who's in the orchestra. And then you may let him in, as someone retires or passes away. And so they're already kind of trained and understood about what this stands for. So that really elongates the level of, the memory, if you will, organizationally for the inception of, how this all mattered to begin with. And so it's a big answer, but it is the answer to how does the Chicago Symphony do, why is it any different? Mm-hmm. It's because it has this great kind of history that people pass on a sense of stewardship, not just ownership and not just leadership. And that's what, those are the shoulders we stand on. So you can say, oh, Farkas was so great, and Herseth this, and Jacobs that, and John Weicker, and Ray Still, and absolutely great players. Yeah. But there are great players in every orchestra you could point to, but it didn't catch fire the way it did the CSO because they didn't have the catalyst for group virtuosity the way we do and have. And so that's, in my study, because I wanted to know this too. It's like, what is because I grew up here. I'm from Elmhurst.
Yeah, when was the first time you heard the Chicago Symphony? Like, how old were you when you?
1975.
Okay.
First was Hummel. My parents took me, and I just started, and I just knew that was really hard, and I couldn't do it.
So Herseth was playing the Hummel Trumpet Concerto, and you heard him play that.
Yeah.
Wow.
In E natural. And that was the first time I think he'd done it in E natural. It's normally done in E flat, so I didn't know anything about that, but I did know he was great. And we sat in the second to last row of the gallery on the right side. I can still tell you just about what seat it was. And I remember I was just transfixed and just knowing. And I think as a child coming to a concert, you also notice the music, but you notice the other people, because as a kid you can't pay attention to anything. But you clearly get the message that this is possible. People are doing this, and there's something I'm probably missing here because the other people like it. And even in your little baby mind, you get it, that eventually this is what I should be doing, even if I can't do it now. That's a big part of education for children, is to see other people acting mature.
Yeah.
and that happens. If you think about adult behavior is part of the CSO experience. Nobody's getting up and throwing their popcorn or anything. It's very thoughtful, and it's receptive, and it's something that engenders some a better life. And I think that's
I think people who out of the things that we do today, this is one of the few things where people are encouraged to stay seated for the entire duration of the piece. Right, they can get up and go between the pieces if they have to. And then also they're encouraged, not to check their phones, not to take pictures. And it's just, I think it's one of the few places where you can go to actually have kind of like an hour break from your phone. Like, I'm at the symphony.
That's right. It's long form thinking.
Yeah.
If you think about it.
Yeah.
We can do everything in little pieces, and you can do a bunch of little chores, and it adds up to getting a lot done today. But the most meaningful things we do are things that require time and careful, painstaking, conscientious thought. And that's what we do. We read a book. Someone writes a book because their idea has so much gravity that it can't be expressed in a pamphlet.
Wow.
And so we write a book. So when you see a book, you're like, well, clearly this is a lot of work and it means something. And if I commit to receiving it, I'm going to get a lot more than if someone just told me, quickly.
Yeah.
And so, we've come in our culture to see a time commitment as somehow as a disadvantage or somehow a loss of value. But in fact, we should embrace it in certain times to know that this is the moment when we do get something bigger than just the little pieces and fragments we get all day long with little flits of stimulus. And so, as kids, I think no child naturally wants to do that. But in many ways, you're sort of forced to do it. You're immersed in it. And eventually you go from just being obedient to taking ownership of that because you get the idea. And so, I mean, that's what it's been for me because I'm just a goofy guy from the suburbs, right? But having apprenticed and been immersed in the language of what the orchestra does, there are levels of literacy in terms of absorbing not only just the beauty of any moment, but like, why does Mahler 9 feel so great at the end? It's because you were there for the whole time.
Yes, absolutely.
You can't tune in for the last 4 minutes and go, oh, it doesn't feel the same. No. And because you haven't committed that amount of your life to be ready for what that has to tell you. And that's metaphorical for a lot of things. And I think in many ways the orchestra tells us we can only sort of short circuit our lives to a certain point without losing our humanity. We can be productive.
Wow.
And this is why we wanted a symphony orchestra. Why did they want to bring the CSO? Why did they want to start it? Because Chicago was a transactional, economic boom. But why did it? Why could it? And the people who knew that it could mean more, why this could be a more thoughtful city than just another city out west. And they knew a symphony orchestra would provide that resource, which it still provides today. And I think has never been more vital.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, especially in this time of uncertainty and, it seems like everyone I'll keep this for myself. I need something that's going to help inspire me and help lift me up, help me to, take me out of sometimes the day-to-day worries. And when I hear classical music, it does. I mean, it makes me feel better. It makes me dream. It shows me what's possible. From humanity, from a group of people.
Yeah. There's a great sort of catchphrase. The medium is the message. And so like when we have, like for example, the invention of the map said that we could sort of capture distances and relative, spaces on paper.
Wow.
The time we could divide the time of the day. We didn't have to wait till it was sort of this time. We could know exactly what time it was.
Yeah. Wow.
So in the medium of the typewriter, so we could capture language and just type it out, without having to have this calligraphy that they once had. And anybody could if you weren't trained in calligraphy, you could still have your idea and write it down without looking illiterate. And so the symphony orchestra medium has a message too, which is what you're talking about, which is that, that our humanity is best expressed and best transmitted when we have a little bit of repose, when we're looking at, focusing on one thing and giving deference to an idea that here's the theme and now it develops and now it repeats and now it comes back. And that sense of receiving it without interruption is what gives us a higher understanding. It gives us wisdom and the voice of our own surety. And so the orchestra still gives that. And in many ways, it's at war with some of the other cultural influences that say, oh, you don't need that. Everything is, divisible into just a little of this, a little of that. And we never focus. And that's
the average watch time on a YouTube video is about 2.5 minutes, right? Or 3 minutes.
Right. They can't do it. So obviously it's great for the listener. It's great for a child too. I've been a great advocate for music education in the schools because the act of trying to become an accomplished musician gives you a sense of maturity someone could say, you got to pay attention, you got to do this and you got to do that. And the kid's just trying not to get in trouble. But to become, accomplished on any instrument at any level requires the same things that they're yelling at you to do. Which pay attention and work on something every day and try, balance your emotions with your discipline and your creativity and your anticipation and your sort of prescriptive, kind of hopes of like, well, what if I tried it this way and what if I did that? And
by teaching students music, we're teaching them to be good human beings, right?
Well, good. I mean, there's other ways to teach people that. It's not the exclusive way, but I think it's a very efficient way.
Yeah.
And it's also something that is time honored. It's enduring truth. Yeah. This has done the trick for a long time, and it still works.
I can speak from experience that music for me has been one of those things I've come back to as a way to just feel like I have a purpose. And I feel like music has really kind of, in a sense, saved my life,
That's right. I mean, it's a group. I mean, for me, I was always picked on as a kid. And so
I think we all were, man. Seriously.
All kind of nerdy, but, and, it's easy to, I wasn't great at sports. And so, the band was a group that sort of accepted me. And so that you could get in a lot of groups in that, but in that way that it also offered this sort of self-developmental kind of truth was great. And it's even if you're not going to become a professional musician, aspiring and working on an instrument is very restorative. The people who maintain their commitment to that always describe it as so valuable. And I'd say to kids, if you're playing football in high school, those are your last 4 years of football ever. Please don't play after that. It's bad for you. Yeah. But you can play, it's the first of 60 years of you playing the trumpet or the flute. And it's something that you can always do and always sort of express yourself in ways that you can't, even in writing or even speaking. And so that's really important. And I think, we have often imposed some sort of a sportsman-like, incentive for kids. Like, you want to be first and you're going to be the leader and you're going to get the job and you're going to be a star. And, those move people to action and competition, and that helps a band in some ways. But it also is it can be at cross purposes with what ultimately gives music power. There needs to be hierarchy, there needs to be dominance, but it's not for its own sake. It's as a mechanism to create beauty and to share energy and truth. And so
as a mechanism to share beauty and truths. I mean,
yeah. And so you're as steeped in this as I am. Especially the American conservatory and university system is looking to recruit and sort of draw people in to, like, don't you want to do this, and doesn't make it look a certain way. And some people shouldn't be studying music and aspiring to be great instrumentalists for reasons of just dominance and victory and prizes. And I think it's okay to kind of get somebody in the door until they take ownership of better values. But I think it can go to the point where, there are professional musicians who their incentive and their enjoyment comes from being the winner, which requires other people to be the loser. And that takes us back to Second Trumpet.
Yeah.
There are some first trumpet players who see Second Trumpet as the necessary loser that facilitates themselves.
We go back to as a first horn player, I'm only as good as my second horn player, right? And my second horn player makes really determines how great I sound. So I mean, from all of us first players, we know the secret is in that that second player.
Yeah, well, and is Jim is a fantastic.
Yeah, fantastic. I mean,
the great
Dale calls him the Rock of Gibraltar.
Yeah, he's right there.
Yeah.
But his predecessor, Norm Schweikert, was just as committed, to that same role, and very influential. And part of Clevenger's, electric sound, having sat behind them playing together, you sort of see the magic trick of how it works.
Wow.
And in my predecessors, Rudy Nashin in the 50s, certainly Vince Chikowitz in the 60s, Charlie Geyer, George Rossberg, the real stalwart second trumpet players added a lot to Herseth's sheen that Herseth got the credit for and deserved a lot of credit. But the sort of some of that mythic, like how is he doing that, is because you're actually hearing another person in combination with him and assigning it. That must be the first.
Wow.
And that's the way it should be. And as a second player, you want that to be the case. You don't feel slighted because you weren't assigned the reward for what it sounded like. And that's another lesson it teaches kids, is like when we can sound great together, it doesn't matter who gets the credit. And that's also at odds often with a lot of people's values. They want to get paid and paid more than they even worked for if they can. And that's, understandable. But is it really helpful for the greater good when we're trying to produce something that's greater than any one of us? And the answer is no. It's not a gig economy. And if you're trying to create something really sacred, in the human, Theodore Thomas wrote a great article for Scribner's magazine in 1881 for the March issue, and he talked about musical possibilities in America, and it was sort of a distillation of what he'd noticed about American audiences touring, the country. And he said, whether anyone has any musical training or not, it's not a direct quote, but the distillation of it is that he said, people recognize excellence. They recognize that someone's worked hard and that there's a lot of, alignment and precision. They're fascinated with that because they inherently know that people really slaved over that to make it right. And I think that's our sort of hook to pull people into a sense of curiosity, but then to become very connected to the energy and the sort of more high-minded beauty and expression that Theodore Thomas heard in the great singers in the 1850s. However you get in the door, as ambassadors for this journey, we need to move people to a sense of what is a higher experience. When are we transformed as opposed to merely entertained?
So that's my next point is. What is this project that you're working on right now? Can you share a little bit about that, or do you want to wait to disclose it until? I mean, I would love to hear about the project that you're working on currently, because it's this mind of what's going to persevere, right? What's gonna elevate like the listener, as opposed to merely entertain.
Right, and that's I'm not sure which project you're talking about.
Okay. No problem.
Let's leave the top secret stuff. But yes,
every project you work on, you want quality, John, and I think that's ultimately the underlying, fundamental question is just that when you go for things, you want quality.
That's right, and I think it bears mentioning that people who work with details themselves or insist at any level, point out the need for improvement. Eventually, they shoot the messenger. And while and this is a universal truth that music can teach a child too, is that when you strive for something better, there will be people who will join you in a unified inspiration, and there are people who resent you because their core value says, "Look, who's going to make me? Why does that matter? If I don't. That's not. You just see as a threat to their kind of supremacy, and so those people will not appreciate your commitment, even though you may be very resolute and very clear about that you're not trying to be dominant, but you're asking them to join you in a collective effort, which Theodore Thomas was doing.
It's just that that saying, it's lonely at the top, right? It takes a lot of dedication, a lot of solitary hours of perseverance, and I think for me, I've noticed myself, the better I get on the horn, the more critical I am as a listener for myself, and the more critical I am for how I want things to sound and the level I want it to be at.
Yes, when you eat from the tree of knowledge, you are no longer in the Garden of Paradise.
Oh, so. That's a good saying. John, that goes back. I want to just kind of look at one thing really quick. You talked about your instruments, but you've also helped design an instrument, and Are you working on anything at the moment that you'd want to talk about? But I know you helped design the Chicago model
Right.
of the Yamaha. Could
I
you?
did. I spent a lot of time on that, and
Everyone that I know that played that horn just loves it. It revolutionized new brass making for trumpets. And I always
yeah.
wished I had like a Chicago model horn, but I mean, I know when that trumpet came out, it was just like revolutionary.
Well, that I think that's not an overstatement. Partially because of the work we put into it, but partially because of what was lacking in the other offerings.
Mm.
And when I was a student, you couldn't get a good orchestral trumpet that was in tune, that was really well built, because as manufacturing goes on, they're looking for ways to make it cheaper and keep the same quality. But inevitably, as generations go by, some of the quality is lost. Some of those original, uh, nuances get sort of thrown by the wayside because most of the people who buy trumpets don't really notice. And so, if you build a trumpet that the best trumpet players can really appreciate, some of your effort is wasted on the people who would have bought it anyway. And so the market kind of is your enemy in the way of keeping the best craftsmanship alive. And so, yes, I did that work, and I'm very proud of the Yamaha instruments. I don't play the Yamaha currently because I have access to the instruments on which it was based.
And what instruments do you play, John?
Well, this is my trumpet in the orchestra is this one. This is made in 1955. It is a Bach C trumpet, and it is if anybody is nerdy enough to know about C trumpet history with the CSO, they know that Fritz Renner authorized 4 trumpets to be purchased from Vincent Bach in 1955.
Wow!
And so he personally designed exact configurations and brought 7. It's about is the most common number, although the people who were there, sometimes say 10. And so the CSO bought 4 of those instruments, which are still in good repair, and we use them. Esteban, our principal trumpet, is playing on the one that Adolf Herseth picked out.
Wow.
He's the pick of the litter, and he sounds great on it, as we know.
Yeah.
This trumpet was one of the rejects of the 7, but I found it about 15 years ago and bought it. So I own this one.
Unbelievable.
CSO. And I'm lucky, and it's the very next serial number after with the one that Herseth played.
Wow.
And they sound great together, partially because we're committed to working together, but partially because just the signature sound of the instruments is so good. And so we take that very seriously, and we've just been doing some recording together at social distance.
Yeah.
And listening back, working out, some of the nuances and listening, making choices. So we've been improving during this time off. And so, yes, this is the instrument I play, and the manufacturing detail to really precisely duplicate this is prohibitively expensive for Yamaha or anyone to duplicate precisely. But they still make excellent instruments.
Yeah.
It's not a criticism, but the point is I have a certain need, and I never took money from Yamaha, so I didn't.
Wow.
It was not,
that was all just a gift that you did to better the instrument and better the art form.
Yeah, and they were grateful for it, and I was grateful for the chance. And you could say, well, what makes you so smart, John? And say, well, nothing. But what I did have was the testing environment.
Yes.
And a big part of trumpet design is I worked with Bob Malone. It was as close as the 20th century, late 20th century version of Vincent Bach in terms of his knowledge and empirical kind of analysis of trumpet making. But even his great achievement can't predict how the trumpet will sound in the orchestra.
Yeah.
And we many trials that were great on their own, but you get in the orchestra and it was not nearly as good. And it's humbling, I'll tell you, because you're kind of high-fiving yourself thinking you invented sliced bread, and in fact, you didn't. And but we did finally come to something that was pretty good that could be manufactured, consistently, and that's your Chicago Model C trumpet. And its companion, B flat and the E flat D and the piccolo and the C cornet, all instruments that went through a strong vetting process in the orchestra. And the nearest thing I can, if someone doesn't know what this is like, it's like if you're looking for a beautiful tie that goes with your suit, and you can see the tie in the store, but until you really put it with the suit, it can be a horrible tie once you try to put it on, but you wouldn't know until you actually put it. So the orchestra is kind of like the suit,
Yes.
and the trumpet's like the tie.
Oh, wow.
And so they're all good tie. You can tell a lousy tie that you don't even have to, you don't even have to try that one on. That's junk. But there are ties that you think, well, that might be nice, and then you get them, and you realize, well, that one I thought was good. It's not really that good. That's trumpet testing right there.
Wow.
Because
what a great analogy.
You're setting it against, or for women, shoes. I dare say they need a pair of shoes that goes exactly with this purse, and
Speaking of Memorial Day, I'm going to bust out my white shoes. That's the rule. After Memorial Day, you can start wearing white shoes.
There we go. I got to get in one commercial here, Dave. Not commercial.
Yeah.
But, I have another trumpet I have to show you.
What is this?
And this is also a C trumpet. This C trumpet was played by William Bachiano in the New York Philharmonic for all the Mahler Symphony recordings conducted by Bruno Walter.
That's so cool.
Which are very influential, and were in the record collection of Adolf Hirscheth. As he was learning Mahler symphonies, he was listening to this trumpet, and Bachiano, who was the principal trumpet of the New York Philharmonic from 1942 until 1974. And upon leaving the Philharmonic, he sold it to Jerry Schwartz, who was the next principal trumpeter and ultimately the music director of the Seattle Symphony. And he got it to someone else, who got someone else, who sold it to me years ago. But this is a fantastic trumpet. A smaller trumpet in its dimensions than what we play in the CSO, but like the Schubert's Besson, has a beautiful voice. And
what year was that built again, John?
This particular trumpet was built in 1952.
Wow!
So it wasn't what original trumpet he played, but he was, he played it.
For a good 30 years of his career, or 20 years, excuse me. Math.
Yeah. Well, that's not.
Yeah. So he started.
This is not. I have to stand corrected. I have a different trumpet that on the Bruno Walter records, but he played this in the New York Philharmonic very notably, and for example, on the Bernstein Young People's concerts, and when he was playing C trumpet, he played this. He also played a D trumpet very notably, and I have that trumpet too, which is
wow, what a piece of history. Wonderful. John, are you ever thinking about opening a museum or offering your collection to the public?
I am. It's a long-term project, but I've also, as you may know, I put together some calendars some years ago to kind of share in brief, some of the important reasons why these instruments, need to be showcased. Wow. And the thing of it is, it's like any collector. People glaze over. They want to hear it for maybe 20 seconds, and then they get it, and they don't want to. So I'm very careful not to go into too much detail.
Wow. But no, it's so fascinating for me. I love instruments and I love the history. John, just kind of wrapping things up, what lessons would you share with students? I mean, I know you love history. You're a devoted historian of the Chicago Symphony. If I've ever had any questions about what recording or who is that in a picture of the Chicago Symphony, I can always go to you to identify that or to answer those questions for me. But what lessons have you learned from studying history?
That's a big question. So
I'd love to hear more about the fact of resilience, because this orchestra has withstood 2 world wars, a Great Depression, a recession in the 80s, a recession in the 2000s, and now this pandemic. And how can we learn about resilience just by looking at the past?
Well, I'll personalize it to both of us. When my first year in the orchestra was Dale Clevenger's 30th. And as you may know, when you have 30 years in the orchestra, they give you an award at a luncheon that's held every year. And then you get to give a speech. And so I was at Dale's speech in my first year. And I think one of the points he made that day bears repeating in the answer to your question. He spoke about how, the CSO is bigger than any one of us. And it sort of has that lesson to teach us, is that, people get in trouble when they think their life and their brand is superior to the energy and the values on which the orchestra stands. And that's true. You can look at it in specific instances where that's clearly has been shown to be the case. And so the answer that in more sort of concrete terms is that history teaches us that a cause that's greater than us, it helps to get us through any hard time ourselves. That we're not trying to be dominant. We're trying to be, just to serve a greater good and to work to the best we can. That's all we can do, and not to be the winner, and not to be, somehow victorious and sort of competing, but to contributing.
Wow.
And there's a big difference.
Yeah.
And I think that's
what can I add?
I think exactly, and I think a lot of educational, well-meaning educational experiences can mislead a student to presume something different, and sometimes something opposite. Mm. And so when the victory is taken from them, they immediately realize, well, then what's the point? Well, the point is that the point you had wasn't the point at all. And so, you're kind of in this time where we're kind of under economic and other kinds of duress. I think the thing to remember is that it's our own, inner voice that calms us, that no one can give us a check big enough and no one can, restore us. We have to do it for ourselves. And it's always been that way, but it can be camouflaged with the din of our societal, ruckus, if you will. And so this forces us to reconsider and to reveal to ourselves where the power comes from.
Wow.
And for some people, that's a religious higher power. For some people, it's just the sense of sovereignty of their own inner strength. Mm. And to find that, if you haven't found that, it's very disquieting, because you imagine like, well, I don't even know what they're talking about. But in some ways, that's what music can teach us. And especially for students who may be aspiring, they wanted to be a great trumpet player or violinist because they like the victory of it and the grandeur and aggrandizement of what may lay in store for them personally. That's a false target, but it was a sustainable target if the culture permitted. If the culture no longer permits it, we have to recalibrate our target.
Yes.
To fit with what is available.
Yes.
And what is available is what's always been available. When CSC musicians were dirt poor in the 1920s and scrounging for everything they could get, they still had an orchestra that sounded good. How could that be? Well, because they were committed to the real reason for making greatness, which is to work together and to transmit beauty and to move people the way they had been moved. And that's what Theodore Thomas did. He was not a rich man at the end. He had periods where he was wealthy, but he some people would say he squandered his money, but he invested his money to pass on a legacy. And what a legacy it was. Wow. Because it not only transmitted, but it sort of reconstituted itself. That it was so he was able to help people to see how meaningful and true it was. And if we played our cards right, if we've done the right things in our lives, that's our immortality, truly, amongst the people we leave behind. And as you can imagine, Phil Farkas and Arnold Jacobs and Adolf Herseth and Frank Risifulli and many others did a lot of that, and their legacies live on because of the investments they made in themselves and in their colleagues and in their
students.
Yeah, exactly. And so, we can pick nits about, well, is it really, do you need the breathing bag, or do you can just, and then, there's things you could say about that. But the point is the spirit of, Schulte had a great quote about Arnold Jacobs, is he's the rarest of jewels. Mm. And he says, a great virtuoso combined with a warm and generous personality.
Wow.
So it's Schulte also saying that virtuosi are often not warm and generous. But he's also lauding Jacobs as being someone who is the best of both. And so I think, well, why does his name endure? Why did he make such an impact? It was because he was a great player, but he was also a great investor. And he was trying to help you see the possibilities in your own playing to give you an autonomy to be creative the way he was.
Wow.
And this comes back to maybe a final word here, is that something Herseth said, which he credited to George Major, who was principal trumpeter of the Boston Symphony, who he studied with after the war. In the phrase, it's a simple phrase. He says, "There are no great teachers, just great students." And you can mean different things to different people. I'll tell you what it means to me. It means that we can't. No one makes you as a you go to study with someone. Oh, they had other great students, so I'll go study with them. No, they had other great students because those people were great students, and the most you can become is a great student. So as accomplished players, we want to teach other people to also be great students.
Wow.
Herseth was a great student. He solved problems on his own. He was never satisfied with what he was doing. He was always aspiring. Certainly Jacobs was even more so. And Farkas, he wrote the books after he left the orchestra. Yeah. I mean, could anybody be more galvanized to keep searching? And that energy is what made them great to begin with. It gave them peace and sort of meaning and purpose, long after they could play well themselves. And they finished on a high note, as it were. And so we should be so lucky, but we can, because understanding their history can guide us to making our best history.
Wow. Fantastic. John, I think that's a great place to wrap up. I really appreciate you spending your morning with us. And again, happy Memorial Day. It's such a pleasure to talk to you and hear all about the history of the Chicago Symphony, hear your inspiring thoughts and views of the orchestra, where we've come from, and a lot of hope about where we're going. So thank you again for your time, and it's really great to have this conversation, to share this with the public. So thank you again.
Thanks so much, David.
Have a wonderful rest of your day, and we'll see you soon. Hopefully soon we'll be playing together.
Yes, sir.
Excellent. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.